The night I gave away my only pair of winter boots, I thought I was helping a homeless old man survive the cold. I had no idea I was stepping into a story that would change the rest of my life. I still remember how the snow sounded under my shoes that night, sharp and brittle like broken glass beneath every step. Chicago winters had always been cruel, but that January felt especially unforgiving. The weather report on the laundromat television kept repeating the same warning over and over. Wind chill 12 below zero. Avoid unnecessary travel. Stay indoors if possible. I smiled quietly when I heard that because for people like me, staying home wasn't always an option. At 68 years old, I was still folding sheets and cleaning industrial dryers at Franklin Street Laundry 5 nights a week. My husband Walter used to tell me I worked harder than anyone he'd ever known. Walter had been gone for almost 4 years now, but sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could still hear his voice beside me. That night my shift ended close to 11. The younger girls hurried out laughing, wrapping thick scarves around their faces before running toward the parking lot. I stayed behind another 15 minutes wiping down the counters because Mrs. Green, the owner, had arthritis in both hands and couldn't manage the heavy cleaning anymore. By the time I stepped outside, snow was falling harder than before. The wind sliced straight through my coat. I pulled the collar tighter and started the 6-block walk toward my apartment building. My boots were old, cracked near the soles, and lined with faded wool that no longer kept much warmth inside, but they were still the only winter boots I owned. Halfway home, I passed Lincoln Park and noticed the benches almost completely buried under snow. Usually no one sat there after dark during winter, but that night I saw a figure alone beneath the dim yellow glow of a street lamp. At first I almost kept walking. In a city this large, people learn not to stop for strangers at night. But then the wind shifted, and I saw the man's hands trembling violently against his coat sleeves. He looked older than me, maybe early 70s, with silver hair dusted white from the snow. His shoes weren't proper winter shoes at all. Thin leather loafers soaked through with slush. I slowed down without meaning to. "Sir," I called carefully. He looked up slowly, his eyes tired and distant like someone who hadn't slept in days. "You all right out here?" He tried to smile, but I could tell he was freezing. "I'll manage," he said softly. His voice surprised me. Calm. Educated. Not what I expected from someone sitting alone on a frozen park bench after midnight. I glanced around. Cars rushed past the street beyond the trees, headlights glowing through the snowfall, but nobody stopped. Nobody even looked. Something twisted inside my chest, because suddenly I remembered Walter during his final winter alive, sitting for hours in a crowded emergency room, while people walked around us pretending not to notice how much pain he was in. I remembered feeling invisible. I remembered promising myself I would never become the kind of person who ignored suffering simply because it was inconvenient. The man rubbed his hands together again, and I noticed his socks were wet through near the ankles. Before I could second-guess myself, I sat down beside him on the freezing bench and started untying my boots. "Ma'am," he said immediately, confused. "What are you doing?" "Your feet are worse than mine," I replied. "These should help for tonight." His eyes widened as I placed the boots beside him. "I can't take those." "Sure you can. Then what will you wear home?" I laughed quietly, though my toes already burned from the cold against the snow. "I grew up in Minnesota. I've survived worse." That wasn't entirely true, but he didn't need to know that. For a moment he simply stared at me, almost speechless. Then he asked something I never forgot. "Why would you help a stranger?" Snowflakes landed softly across his shoulders while the city lights shimmered behind him. I looked down at my thin gloves and answered honestly. "Because nobody helped my husband before he died." The man lowered his eyes after that, and something in his expression changed completely. Not pity, not embarrassment. It looked more like heartbreak. A long black car suddenly appeared near the curb across the street, its headlights cutting through the storm. I barely noticed it. I was too busy standing carefully on numb feet and wrapping my scarf tighter around my face. "Keep the boots," I told him gently. "Chicago nights don't forgive people." Then I turned and walked barefoot through the snow toward home, while behind me, the stranger watched silently from the frozen bench. By the time I reached my apartment building, I could barely feel my feet. The hallway radiator on the second floor had been broken for weeks, and the cold drifted through the building like smoke under a door. I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the railing while melted snow soaked through my thin socks. Somewhere down the hall, Somebody was arguing through paper-thin walls, and the smell of burnt coffee lingered near old Mrs. Donnelly's apartment. Everything about that building felt tired lately, including me. Inside my apartment, the silence wrapped around me immediately. I locked the door, leaned against it for a second, and closed my eyes. Walter used to greet me every night no matter how late my shift ended. Sometimes with tea already waiting. Sometimes pretending to complain about how long I worked while secretly warming my slippers beside the heater. Now the apartment only answered with silence and the soft humming of the refrigerator. I shuffled into the kitchen and filled a kettle with water while rubbing warmth back into my toes. My feet were red from the snow, but thankfully not injured. Still, I knew tomorrow would hurt. I only owned one other pair of shoes, and they were thin canvas sneakers better suited for spring than a Chicago winter. The kettle began whistling softly. I poured hot water into a chipped mug and dropped in the last tea bag from the cabinet. Then I opened the pantry and stared at what remained inside. 1 can of tomato soup, half a loaf of bread, crackers, oatmeal packets from the dollar store. Payday was still 4 days away. I smiled faintly to myself because Walter would have teased me for giving away my boots when I could barely afford groceries. But deep down, I knew he would have done exactly the same thing. I carried the soup to the couch and reached for the remote control, mostly for noise. Holiday commercials filled the screen. Families laughing around fireplaces. Couples carrying shopping bags through snow-covered streets. Expensive jewelry sparkling under bright lights. I muted the television almost immediately. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, and for one hopeful second, I thought maybe Daniel was calling. Instead, it was a text message from Melissa in the family group chat. She had sent photos from some upscale steakhouse downtown. Crystal chandeliers glowed above their table, while Daniel smiled beside her holding a glass of wine. Their teenage son Tyler sat between them wearing a suit jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The caption read, "Family dinner before Christmas shopping downtown." I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Daniel looked happy, healthy, comfortable, but there was no message asking how I was doing. No invitation. No mention of seeing me before Christmas. A second text arrived from Daniel himself only moments later. "Sorry we missed your call yesterday, Mom. Busy week at work. We will try to stop by after the holidays." I quietly set the phone face down on the table. After the holidays. People always promise time later when they had already decided you were no longer part of the present. I finished my soup slowly while snow tapped softly against the windows. Around 1 in the morning, I finally stood to get ready for bed when a sharp ache shot through my left foot. I grabbed the edge of the counter until it passed. Giving away those boots had been foolish. Kind maybe, but foolish too. I brushed my teeth, changed into flannel pajamas, and pulled an extra blanket from the closet because the heater barely worked near the bedroom. Before turning off the lamp, I opened the drawer beside my bed and looked at the old photograph resting inside. Walter sat beside me on a fishing dock 20 years earlier, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. His arm rested around my shoulders, and sunlight reflected off the lake behind us. Sometimes I worried I was forgetting the sound of his voice. Sometimes I spoke out loud in the apartment just to pretend someone still answered back. "I hope I did the right thing tonight," I whispered quietly to the photograph. Outside, wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the glass. Somewhere across the city, an old man I did not know was wearing my boots while I stood barefoot on freezing hardwood floors wondering if kindness still mattered in a world that barely noticed people like us anymore. The next morning, my alarm rang at 6:30. I slipped my aching feet into those thin canvas sneakers and immediately regretted it. Snow still covered the sidewalks outside in thick, icy layers. I wrapped plastic grocery bags around my socks before putting the shoes on, an old trick Walter taught me years ago when money was tight. As I stepped outside into the freezing dawn, I noticed a sleek black car parked across the street from my building. The engine idled quietly while snow gathered across the windshield. I frowned slightly because cars like that never came into this neighborhood. Then the tinted window lowered just enough for someone inside to look directly at me before the vehicle slowly pulled away into the morning traffic. The cold that morning felt sharper than the night before. Snow crunched beneath my sneakers while icy water slowly seeped through the plastic bags around my socks. Every few steps I could feel the sting in my toes, but I kept walking toward Franklin Street Laundry because missing work was not something people in my position could afford. The sky over Chicago hung low and gray, heavy with more snow waiting to fall. Traffic crawled past in long lines while bundled strangers hurried along sidewalks without looking at one another. I kept thinking about that black car outside my apartment building. Something about it unsettled me. Not frightening exactly, just strange. Wealth had a certain quietness to it, and that car carried the kind of silence money created. By the time I reached the laundromat, my hands were trembling from the cold. Mrs. Green stood behind the front counter counting quarters into paper rolls. Her reading glasses rested halfway down her nose, and the old radio near the register played. Soft Christmas music from the 1970s. Lord above, Evelyn, she gasped when she saw my shoes. You walked here in those. I smiled faintly and brushed snow off my sleeves. I will survive. She frowned deeply. You are going to catch pneumonia trying to be stubborn. I almost told her about the old man in the park, but somehow the story felt too personal to explain out loud. Instead, I tied on my faded blue apron and started sorting towels from the overnight wash bins. Around 10:30 that morning, the front bell above the laundromat door chimed softly. I looked up automatically and nearly dropped the stack of folded sheets in my hands. Two men in dark coats entered first, both tall and serious-looking, the kind of men who scanned every corner of a room before taking another step. Then the older man from the park walked in behind them. Except he no longer looked like the lonely stranger from the frozen bench. His silver hair was neatly combed now. A charcoal wool overcoat hung perfectly across his shoulders, and polished black gloves covered the same trembling hands I had seen the night before. But what caught my attention most was his expression. Calm, composed, almost elegant. The entire laundromat seemed to fall quiet around him. Mrs. Green straightened immediately behind the counter, while one of the younger employees stopped pushing a laundry cart altogether. The man's eyes found mine instantly. Good morning, Miss Carter, he said warmly. I blinked in confusion. You know my name? A faint smile touched his face. I hope you will forgive the intrusion. Before I could answer, one of the men beside him stepped forward carrying several large shopping bags. Expensive ones. The kind from stores I only passed while riding the bus downtown. Sir, I whispered awkwardly. You did not have to come all this way. Actually, he replied gently, I felt it was necessary. He nodded toward the bags, and the assistant carefully placed them on the folding table nearest me. Open them, please. My hands hesitated before lifting the first bag. Inside sat a beautiful pair of leather winter boots lined with cream-colored fur. Brand new. Another bag held gloves, scarves, thick wool socks, and a dark green winter coat softer than anything I had touched in years. I stared speechless at the table while heat rushed into my face. I cannot accept these, I finally said quietly. Why not? He asked. Because people do not buy things like this for strangers. His eyes rested on me for a long moment before he answered. Last night, a stranger gave me the only warm thing she owned. The laundromat remained silent except for the humming dryers behind us. I felt suddenly embarrassed by all the attention. I only wanted to help, I said softly. I know. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a cream-colored envelope. There is also this. I stepped back immediately. No, I do not want money. A look of surprise crossed his face, almost as if he was unused to hearing refusal. Miss Carter, please. No, I repeated gently. I appreciate the kindness, but helping somebody should not come with a price tag. For the first time since entering the laundromat, the man laughed quietly under his breath. Not mocking, more like genuine disbelief. He slowly lowered the envelope. Do you know, he said softly, most people spend their entire lives asking me for something? I looked at him carefully then. The expensive coat, the assistants, the polished car waiting outside the window. Suddenly the pieces no longer felt random. Who are you? I asked. His smile faded slightly into something sadder. Just someone who needed kindness more than he realized. Before leaving, he glanced once toward my thin sneakers still damp from snow. Please wear the boots, he said quietly. Chicago winters are unforgiving. Then he turned toward the door while the two assistants followed behind him. But just before stepping outside, he paused and looked back at me one last time. I would like to see you again, Miss Carter. After they disappeared into the falling snow, Mrs. Green hurried toward me whispering so loudly it barely counted as whispering at all. Evelyn, she gasped, gripping my arm tightly. Do you even realize who that man is? Mrs. Green looked at me as though I had just shaken hands with the president himself. Her eyes stayed fixed on the laundromat door long after the black car disappeared into traffic. Evelyn, she whispered again, lowering her voice this time. That was William Whitmore. The name meant nothing to me at first. I frowned slightly while pulling one of the new gloves from the shopping bag. The leather felt impossibly soft against my hands. Should I know who that is? Mrs. Green stared at me in disbelief. Only one of the richest men in Illinois. I almost laughed because the idea sounded absurd. Billionaires did not sit alone freezing on park benches in Lincoln Park after midnight. Billionaires lived behind gates and security systems. They traveled in private cars and ate in restaurants where people like me could not even afford appetizers. But then I remembered the black car outside my apartment building. The assistants. The way everybody in the laundromat had gone silent the moment he entered. Suddenly my stomach tightened. You are serious, I murmured. Mrs. Green grabbed her phone from beneath the counter and typed quickly before turning the screen toward me. There he was. The same silver hair. The same calm eyes. Only now he stood beside politicians and celebrities at charity galas wearing tuxedos worth more than my entire apartment. William Whitmore. Real estate investor. Estimated net worth over $4 billion. I slowly lowered myself onto one of the folding chairs beside the dryers because my knees suddenly felt weak. Oh my goodness, I whispered under my breath. Mrs. Green folded her arms tightly. Honey, what exactly happened between you and that man? I looked down at the shopping bags beside me and shook my head slowly. I gave him my boots. The silence after those words felt almost comical. One of the younger girls working near the dryers accidentally dropped a stack of towels while staring at me open-mouthed. Mrs. Green blinked twice before finally saying, You gave a billionaire your shoes? When she said it out loud like that, it sounded ridiculous even to me. The rest of my shift passed in a strange fog. Customers came and went while snow continued falling outside the windows, but my mind kept drifting back to the look on William Whitmore's face when I refused the envelope. He had seemed genuinely surprised, not offended, just unprepared for someone wanting nothing from him. Around lunchtime, I finally opened the envelope anyway, mostly because I worried there might be a note inside. There was no money. Instead, I found a cream-colored card with elegant handwriting. Miss Evelyn Carter. Dinner tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. Whitmore Grand Hotel. Car service provided if desired. I stared at the card for a long moment before flipping it over. At the bottom, written in smaller ink, was a single sentence. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. The rest of the day became increasingly uncomfortable because Mrs. Green could not stop talking about it. Every customer she trusted enough to gossip with somehow learned that a billionaire had visited the laundromat looking for me. By 4 o'clock, even the delivery driver asked if I was secretly famous. I tried laughing it off, but deep inside I felt uneasy. People with that kind of wealth lived in entirely different worlds. Worlds where mistakes could ruin ordinary people without effort. When my shift finally ended, I carried the shopping bags home carefully through the snow. The new boots kept my feet wonderfully warm, though I still felt guilty wearing something so expensive. Inside my apartment, I placed the invitation card on the kitchen table and simply stared at it while heating canned soup on the stove. Whitmore Grand Hotel was one of the most luxurious hotels in downtown Chicago. Walter and I had walked past it once during our anniversary trip years ago. I still remembered joking that the flower arrangements in the lobby probably cost more than our car. My phone rang suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered quickly, surprised because he rarely called during weekdays. Hey Mom, he said casually. Melissa saw something online today. Did some rich businessman really show up at your work? I paused immediately. How would Melissa know that? Somebody posted about it on social media, he replied. Apparently the guy owns half the city or something. I could already hear Melissa talking faintly in the background, asking questions. It was nothing important, I said carefully. Just somebody I met. Daniel laughed awkwardly. Well, if the guy is really loaded, maybe ask him to buy you a better apartment. Melissa laughed too somewhere behind him. I smiled faintly, even though something inside me hurt. My own son sounded more amused by the possibility of money than concerned about why a billionaire had visited his mother at all. After we hung up, I carried my soup to the window and looked out at the snowy street below. Across the road, beneath the flickering street lamp near the bus stop, I noticed the same black car parked quietly with its lights off. And for the second night in a row, Somebody inside appeared to be watching my building. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that black car parked beneath the street lamp outside my building. It remained there for nearly 2 hours before finally disappearing sometime after midnight. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Wealthy people hired security. Important people monitored situations carefully. Still, something about being watched made the apartment feel smaller than usual. The next morning, snow continued falling over Chicago in thick gray waves. I woke early and stood in front of my tiny bedroom mirror staring at the invitation card again while holding one of Walter's old sweaters against my chest. Dinner at the Whitmore Grand Hotel. 7 o'clock. My first instinct had been to decline politely. People like William Whitmore belonged in newspapers and television interviews, not in the life of a 68-year-old widow who folded towels for minimum wage. But another part of me could not ignore the loneliness I had seen in his eyes that night on the bench. It was the same loneliness I carried myself. Around noon, Melissa called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded sweeter than usual, which immediately made me suspicious. "Evelyn," she said warmly, "Daniel told me about your little billionaire friend." I sighed softly. "He is not my friend." "Well, whatever he is, this sounds exciting." I could practically hear her smiling through the phone. "So are you? Really having dinner at the Whitmore Grand?" "I have not decided yet." There was a brief pause before Melissa spoke again, more carefully this time. "Honestly, you should go. Opportunities like this do not happen twice." Opportunities. The word sat heavily in my stomach because she did not sound concerned about me at all. She sounded curious about access, about status, about money. "Melissa," I asked quietly, "if he worked at a gas station instead of owning hotels, would you still care?" Silence filled the line for a second too long. "That is not fair," she finally replied with a nervous laugh. "I just think it could be good for you to meet important people." Important people. As though kindness only mattered when wealth stood behind it. After hanging up, I opened my closet and stared at my clothes for nearly 20 minutes. Most of what I owned came from department store clearance racks or thrift shops. Nothing looked suitable for a luxury hotel. Finally, I reached toward the back of the closet and gently pulled out the dark blue dress I had worn at Walter's funeral. Simple, elegant, timeless. I had not touched it in years. At 6 o'clock sharp, a black town car arrived outside my building. The driver stepped out holding an umbrella while snow drifted across the sidewalks in silver waves beneath the streetlights. Several neighbors peeked through their curtains as I locked my apartment door. Mrs. Donnelly nearly dropped her grocery bag when she saw the car waiting for me downstairs. The ride downtown felt unreal. Chicago glowed beautifully beneath fresh snow while Christmas lights reflected across frozen sidewalks and crowded storefront windows. I pressed my hand lightly against the warm leather seat, trying not to look overwhelmed by everything around me. Walter would have loved this view. He always said the city looked magical during winter storms. When we finally arrived at the Whitmore Grand Hotel, my breath caught in my throat. The building rose above the street like something from an old movie. Golden lights spilled from massive windows while uniformed doormen welcomed guests arriving in luxury cars. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors so perfect I almost felt nervous stepping on them. People moved through the lobby wearing designer coats and expensive jewelry, while soft piano music floated through the air. I suddenly became painfully aware of my age, my modest dress, my nervous hands. "Miss Carter," I turned to see a young woman approaching with a warm smile. She appeared to be in her early 30s, elegant but kind-eyed, with dark blonde hair pinned neatly behind her shoulders. "I am Sophie Whitmore," she said gently. "My grandfather is waiting for you." Grandfather? The word surprised me enough that I stopped walking. Sophie noticed immediately and lowered her voice. "You did not know?" I shook my head slowly. He never mentioned family. Something unreadable flickered briefly across her expression before she smiled again. "Grandfather does not mention much these days." She guided me through the hotel lobby toward a private dining room overlooking the snowy Chicago skyline. My hands tightened around my purse as we approached the doors. Through the glass, I could see William Whitmore standing beside the window in a dark suit, staring out at the falling snow with the same lonely expression he wore on the frozen bench that night. Then he turned, saw me entering the room, and for the first time since Walter died, somebody looked genuinely happy simply because I had arrived. William stepped forward the moment I entered the dining room, and suddenly the billionaire from newspaper articles disappeared again. Standing there beside the window overlooking snowy Chicago, he looked less like one of the richest men in America and more like the tired stranger I had met on that frozen bench. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, pulling out my chair himself before I could protest. "Thank you for coming." I smiled nervously while sitting down. I am still not entirely sure why I am here. A faint sadness crossed his face at that. Neither am I, if I am being honest. Sophie quietly excused herself after pouring water into our glasses, leaving the two of us alone in the private dining room. Soft piano music drifted faintly from somewhere deeper inside the hotel, while snow swirled outside the tall windows. The table between us looked far too elegant for someone like me. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath candlelight, and silver utensils reflected the city lights beyond the glass. I folded my hands carefully in my lap, terrified of touching the wrong thing. William seemed to notice immediately because he smiled gently and loosened his tie slightly. "You look uncomfortable," he said. "That obvious?" "Only because I feel the same way at dinners like this." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "I doubt that very much." "Miss Carter," he replied quietly, "people assume money makes you belong everywhere. The truth is, it often makes you trust nowhere." That sentence lingered heavily between us. Over dinner, he asked me questions nobody had asked in years. Not polite surface questions about weather or work, but real questions. What kind of nurse had I been before retirement? What Walter was like? Whether I still enjoyed reading. When I mentioned loving old mystery novels, his entire face brightened because apparently his late wife had loved them too. Slowly, my nervousness faded. For the first time in a very long while, I felt listened to instead of tolerated. At one point, the waiter brought roasted salmon with vegetables arranged beautifully across delicate white plates. I hesitated before eating because the meal looked more expensive than anything I had ever ordered myself. William noticed and quietly said, "Please do not worry about appearances tonight. I invited you because I wanted honesty, not performance." So I relaxed. A little. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I told him about Walter building birdhouses in our tiny garage every spring, about working night shifts at St. Mary's Hospital when Daniel was young, about the silence that settles into a home after losing the person who made it feel alive. William listened to every word carefully, almost hungrily, as though he had spent years surrounded by conversations that meant nothing. Eventually, he stared down into his untouched coffee cup and said quietly, "My wife Eleanor died 3 years ago." His voice changed when he said her name. Softer. Fragile somehow. "I am sorry," I whispered sincerely. He nodded once. After she passed, everybody around me became very attentive. Lawyers, investors, family members I had not spoken to in years. A bitter smile touched his lips. But nobody asked if I was lonely. I understood that feeling too well. "Grief changes how people look at you," I said quietly. "Some avoid you because they do not know what to say. Others only see weakness." William looked at me carefully then. "And what do you see?" I thought about that frozen bench, the soaked shoes, the trembling hands, the sadness hidden behind calm eyes. "I see someone who is tired," I answered honestly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted quietly outside while the city lights shimmered below us. Then William surprised me by laughing softly under his breath. "Do you know," he said, "most people spend years trying to impress me. You are the first person in a long time who simply speaks to me like I am human." Heat rose faintly into my cheeks. "That is because you are human." His expression shifted then into something unexpectedly emotional. He turned slightly toward the window before speaking again. "The night we met, I had just left a dinner with my own family." He paused for several seconds. "By the end of the evening, I realized every person at that table cared more about my will than my well-being. Something painful tightened in my chest hearing that, because suddenly his loneliness made perfect sense. Wealth could fill houses, but empty relationships. Before I could respond, William reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully placed a small velvet box beside my plate. I immediately shook my head. "No, absolutely not." "Please," he said gently. "It is not jewelry." Reluctantly, I opened the box. Inside rested a silver key attached to a small leather tag embossed with elegant gold letters. "Lake House 7. I looked up in confusion. William smiled faintly, though his eyes remained strangely serious. Every winter, he said quietly, that house sits empty beside Lake Geneva while people freeze on Chicago streets. He pushed the box slightly closer toward me. I think it deserves someone warm inside it instead. I stared at the silver key resting inside the velvet box while my mind struggled to understand what William was offering me. A lake house. People like me did not receive gifts like that. We received discount coupons in the mail and grocery store reward points. We reused tea bags and worried about heating bills during January. Slowly, I closed the box and pushed it gently back toward him. I cannot take this, I whispered. William did not touch the box. Why? Because it is too much. A sad smile crossed his face then. Miss Carter, do you know what is too much? He leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced toward the snowy skyline outside the window. Owning 6 homes while people sleep on heating grates downtown. His voice remained calm, but underneath it I heard exhaustion. That house sits empty 10 months a year. Meanwhile, you walked barefoot through snow because you gave your boots to a stranger. I lowered my eyes immediately, embarrassed by the attention. Anybody decent would have done the same. William looked directly at me. No, he said quietly. They would not. The sincerity in his voice unsettled me because deep down I knew he was probably right. Most people hurried past suffering if it interrupted their schedules. They donated online during holidays and called themselves compassionate without ever touching discomfort directly. But kindness that cost something had become rare. We left the hotel close to 10 o'clock that evening. Snow had finally stopped falling, leaving Chicago glowing beneath fresh white streets and golden lights. William insisted the driver take me home personally. Before stepping into the car, he paused beside me beneath the hotel awning. Please think about the lake house, he said gently. No conditions, no obligations, just warmth. During the drive home, I held the velvet box tightly in my lap while city lights blurred outside the windows. I kept thinking about Walter, about how hard we worked our entire lives just to stay afloat, about all the winters we spent layering blankets because turning up the heat cost too much. If he were sitting beside me now, he probably would have laughed and said, "Well, Evelyn, maybe heaven finally noticed you." When the car stopped outside my apartment building, I noticed something unusual immediately. Daniel's car sat parked crookedly near the curb. Melissa climbed out the moment she saw the town car arrive. Her eyes widened slightly as she stared at the driver opening my door for me. "Wow," she said with a nervous laugh as I stepped onto the sidewalk. "You really are hanging around billionaires now." Daniel stood beside her with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. "Hey, Mom." I blinked in surprise. "What are you both doing here?" Melissa answered before he could. "We wanted to check on you." I looked at the expensive SUV parked behind them and almost smiled at how quickly concern appeared once wealth entered the conversation. Inside my apartment, Melissa immediately noticed the velvet box in my hands. "What is that?" she asked casually, though her eyes sharpened with interest. "Nothing important," I replied quietly, setting it near the kitchen counter. Daniel glanced around the apartment while rubbing his palms together against the cold. "You really should move somewhere nicer, Mom." That sentence stung more than he probably realized because I had lived in that apartment for nearly 12 years without him once offering help. Melissa walked slowly around the room, pretending to admire things while subtly searching for information. "So what exactly does this William Whitmore guy want from you?" she finally asked. "Nothing." She raised one eyebrow. "Nobody rich spends this kind of time on strangers for no reason." I folded my coat carefully over the chair before answering. Maybe he was simply lonely. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel that lasted barely a second, but told me everything. They did not understand loneliness unless it came with a price tag. Then Tyler surprised me. I had not even realized my grandson was standing quietly near the doorway until he spoke. "Grandma," he asked softly, "is it true you gave that guy your boots?" I nodded once. Tyler stared at me for a second before smiling faintly. "That is actually really cool." Melissa immediately interrupted. "Tyler, do not be rude." "I am not being rude," he replied. "Most people would not do that." For the first time all evening, somebody sounded impressed for the right reason. My chest warmed slightly hearing it. After another 20 uncomfortable minutes of questions disguised as concern, Daniel finally stood to leave. But before walking out, Melissa glanced once more toward the velvet box on my counter. "If he offers you opportunities," she said carefully, "you should think smart about them." Opportunities again. Not friendship. Not kindness. Transactions. Once they left, the apartment fell quiet once more. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the silver key beneath the soft overhead light. Then my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I hope you arrived home safely. And for reasons I could not fully explain, seeing those simple words affected me more deeply than the expensive gifts ever could. The days leading up to Christmas passed strangely after that dinner. For the first time in years, my phone rang more often than collection agencies or pharmacy reminders. Sometimes it was Sophie checking whether I needed anything. Sometimes it was William himself asking small questions that somehow turned into hour-long conversations. He asked what kind of music Walter loved. I asked why somebody with $4 billion still looked lonely whenever people stopped talking. Slowly, a quiet friendship formed between us, though I still struggled to understand why a man like William Whitmore cared so much about someone like me. Then one snowy afternoon, everything changed again. I had just finished folding towels at the laundromat when Sophie arrived, unexpectedly looking pale and exhausted. The moment I saw her expression, my stomach tightened. What happened? I asked immediately. Sophie glanced around the laundromat nervously before lowering her voice. Grandfather collapsed during a board meeting this morning. My hands froze against the warm laundry stack. Is he all right? The doctors say it was exhaustion combined with stress. She swallowed hard. He is stable now, but the family is already circling him like vultures. Anger flickered briefly across her face, the first real emotion I had seen her openly show. His son arrived at the hospital asking about legal paperwork before asking about his health. My chest tightened painfully hearing that, because suddenly I understood why William had sat alone on that frozen bench in the first place. Money had surrounded him with people, but stripped away trust. Sophie looked at me carefully then. He keeps asking for you. For me. He refused visitors this morning except his attorney and me. Then he told the nurses he wanted Evelyn Carter. I stood speechless for a moment. Nobody had needed me like that in years. Not since Walter died. Sophie drove me downtown through heavy evening traffic while snow drifted softly across the windshield. The hospital sat glowing against the dark winter sky, enormous and polished like everything else connected to wealth. Inside the private floor reserved for elite patients, security guards stood outside William's room. One of them immediately opened the door when he saw Sophie approaching. William looked older lying in that hospital bed. The silver in his hair seemed brighter beneath the dim lights, and exhaustion lined his face deeply. But the moment he saw me enter, some of that tension eased from his expression. You came, he said softly. Of course I came. I moved closer carefully while Sophie quietly stepped outside to give us privacy. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Machines hummed softly beside the bed while snow floated beyond the hospital windows. Finally, William sighed heavily. I spent 30 years building an empire, he murmured. And somehow I created a family that measures love in percentages. I sat quietly beside him because sometimes grief did not need advice. It only needed witness. After a while, he turned his head slightly toward me. Do you know what my son asked me this morning? I shook my head. William laughed bitterly under his breath. Whether my attorneys had updated the trust documents recently. Pain moved through me hearing that, because it sounded too familiar. Maybe not with billions of dollars involved, but loneliness inside families always sounded similar. William studied me quietly then. You understand this feeling better than most people. I looked down at my hands folded in my lap. After Walter died, I admitted softly, people stopped seeing me as part of the future. I became someone to visit occasionally, someone to worry about politely during holidays. William nodded slowly as though every word confirmed something he already feared. Then his expression changed slightly. Sophie told me Daniel and your daughter-in-law have become very interested in my existence lately. Heat rose faintly into my cheeks because even I had noticed the shift. Melissa suddenly called every day now. Daniel offered to drive me places after ignoring my bus rides for years. Last night, Melissa even suggested I should network carefully because wealthy friendships could open doors for the whole family. I hated how transactional it all felt. They are not bad people, I said quietly, though the words sounded weaker than I intended. William smiled sadly. No, but comfort changes people. He reached slowly toward the bedside table and picked up a folded document. After my collapse today, my attorney recommended reviewing everything immediately. I frowned slightly. Everything. My will. My trusts. My foundations. He looked directly into my eyes then, calm but serious. And for the first time in years, I realized the only person I trust completely is a woman who once walked barefoot through snow for me. Before I could answer, the hospital room door suddenly opened sharply. A tall man in an expensive navy coat stepped inside without knocking, followed by a sharply dressed blonde woman carrying a leather handbag. Both stopped cold the moment they saw me sitting beside William's bed. The man's jaw tightened instantly. "Father," he said slowly, "who exactly is this woman?" The tension inside the hospital room changed instantly the moment William's son walked through the door. He looked to be in his early 50s, tall and sharply dressed with the same silver eyes as his father, but none of the warmth. The blonde woman beside him clutched her handbag tightly while studying me with thinly disguised suspicion. William did not look surprised to see them, only tired. "Richard," he said calmly, "this is Evelyn Carter." Richard barely acknowledged me with a glance before turning back toward the bed. "Father, we have been looking for you all evening." His voice carried the polished control of somebody used to boardrooms and negotiations. "The attorneys are waiting downstairs." William leaned back slightly against his pillows. "Then they can continue waiting." The blonde woman stepped forward then, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. "We were concerned," she said smoothly. "You gave everyone quite a scare today." I recognized the tone immediately, polite on the surface, calculating underneath. William looked out the window instead of at her. "Interesting," he murmured quietly. "Because the first question Richard asked this morning involved trust documents, not my health." The room fell silent. Richard's jaw tightened. "Father, this is not the time for drama." "No," William replied softly. "It is finally time for honesty." I lowered my eyes awkwardly, suddenly feeling as though I was witnessing something deeply private. But before I could excuse myself, William gently touched my hand resting near the bed rail. "Please stay." That small gesture changed everything. Richard's expression darkened immediately. The blonde woman folded her arms tightly. "Who exactly is this woman?" Richard asked again, slower this time. William answered before I could speak. "Someone kind enough to help me when nobody else did." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "Father, you cannot seriously be involving strangers in personal family matters." Something inside me stiffened hearing the word strangers spoken that way, as though kindness required bloodlines or legal contracts to matter. William's eyes sharpened slightly. "A stranger gave me her only winter boots while my own family argued over my estate." Nobody answered that, not even the blonde woman. A heavy silence settled across the room while snow drifted softly beyond the hospital windows. Finally, Richard adjusted his coat and changed his tone entirely. "Father, the board is nervous after today. Investors are already asking questions. We need stability right now." William smiled faintly. "Interesting choice of words." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," William replied calmly, "that I spent 30 years believing financial stability mattered more than emotional honesty. Now I am lying in a hospital bed realizing I barely recognize the people standing around me." The blonde woman stepped closer carefully. "William, everybody here loves you." For the first time all evening, William looked directly at her. "Then why do I feel lonelier around my family than I did freezing alone in a public park?" Her expression cracked slightly after that. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose before finally looking toward me again. "Miss Carter," he said politely, though tension still edged his voice, "perhaps you should give our family some privacy." Before I could respond, William spoke immediately. "No." The single word hung firmly in the air. "Evelyn stays." Richard stared at his father in disbelief. "You are choosing a stranger over your own family?" William's face softened unexpectedly then. "No, Richard," he said quietly. "I am choosing sincerity over performance." I felt deeply uncomfortable sitting there between generations of unresolved resentment and wealth beyond anything I could imagine. Yet at the same time, I understood William's pain completely. Loneliness inside families could feel colder than any winter street. Sophie entered moments later carrying coffee cups and immediately sensed the tension. Her eyes moved carefully between Richard and William before settling briefly on me with quiet understanding. "The attorneys are downstairs," she said softly. "Grandfather, they need your signature regarding the foundation meeting next week." William nodded slowly before turning back toward me. There is something important happening on Christmas Eve, he said quietly. A public event for the Whitmore Winter Relief Foundation. Sophie looked slightly surprised hearing him mention it. I would like you there with me, Evelyn. Richard immediately frowned again. Father, that event involves donors, executives, city officials. Exactly, William interrupted calmly. People who should remember why charity exists in the first place. Then he reached toward the bedside table and picked up the velvet box containing the lake house key. He pressed it gently into my hands once more. Please stop refusing warmth simply because you are used to surviving cold. My throat tightened unexpectedly hearing those words because they touched something deeper than money. For years I had accepted loneliness as normal, accepted being overlooked as part of aging. But sitting beside that hospital bed, surrounded by wealth and strained family smiles, I realized something quietly heartbreaking. The richest man I had ever met was not searching for admiration. He was searching for kindness that did not come with conditions. And somehow, without meaning to, I had become the only place where he still believed he could find it.